Hey, Matt Sitter here, CEO of AFN. Our fundamental belief at AFN is that change is where opportunity happens. And the best way to find opportunity in change is a network that is diverse in experience, expertise, and perspective. And with our events, we work to broaden that perspective by bringing experts in who can talk to us about some of the things that are most important for them. Today, we're going to be talking about growing, performing, and sustaining. And what a diagnostic that Nick had put together. Nick Petrie, he is head of design and delivery at Network Leader. Thinks a lot about networks, so very close to my own heart. And he's lead researcher on the vertical mindset indicator. He spent a ton of time in the leadership development space and some really interesting experience. Welcome, Nick. It's good to see you.
You too, Matt. Good to see you.
So as we're thinking about, this is a grow, perform, and sustain workshop, maybe if you could just give us a couple ideas on how you started thinking about this initially and what you've built up in developing that.
Sure thing, yeah. So I got interested in this probably 3 years ago. It was when the pandemic began. And I had clients all around the world, and what we started noticing is the world had changed for everyone. They were working virtually, they were some were hybrid, but it was very different. So the first thing we saw is everyone needed to learn a whole lot of new things. And so that puts quite a strain on people immediately. So they had that need, they had to grow and learn. The second need they had, though, is they needed to perform, and they needed to deliver right now. It was a bit of a crisis, as all of you remember. And so bosses needed this, customers needed this. So they were trying to perform really hard. And the way most of them were trying to do it, because they had a high work ethic, they were starting earlier in the morning. They were working later at nights. They were working through their breaks. It was meeting to meeting to meeting. And in the short term, they were all fine. They performed well. They learned a lot. But it was a sort of short-term strategy. And what we saw after 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, people started to tip over. And a lot of them started to burn out. And so I got really interested in this topic and said, let's look into it and see what's actually going on for people in workplaces.
Good deal. And maybe just to dig in a little bit further on that, and I'll reach into the network side of things here. Yeah. When we saw performance go up in the first days of the pandemic, people cite that all the time as just like, hey, all of a sudden we saw improvement in things. But what was the impact? Why do you think that happened, A? And B, what do you think the impact was on people's networks around that?
Yeah, it was very interesting because we were collecting data on that at the time through our network assessment. And so what happened is people got super focused and they sort of just closed in as a team and got very task focused. And so people were just like, get stuff done, get stuff done. They weren't really bridging across the organization to other parts that are outside of it. And so productivity did spike immediately because it was so task focused. But what happened is people's networks started to dwindle and they became disconnected from the rest of the business. A lot of silos opened up and it didn't actually sustain over the long term. It was a lot of negative impacts for the long term because of that intense closed focus.
Well, and when we think about people kind of shutting down certain aspects of their network and really making it very tight, what are some of the long-term impacts that we've seen on that?
Yeah, well, you hear less information. You don't get the weak signals from across the business or from across the industry that you used to. It's harder to lead change because you're not in contact with different stakeholders. It's harder to access resources. People become less likely to get promoted when they've got a closed network because people don't know about them very much. And it becomes very difficult for the organization to collaborate properly because everyone starts working in silos.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, and it probably takes some work to undo a little bit of that too.
It sure does. And, organizations have sort of struggled to do that. And, a lot of people went remote and a lot of people moved out of their cities where they're working. And, I know a lot of people are returning to office now, but it's been a bit of a struggle to put all the network connections back together how they were before. So it's trade-offs, isn't it? Because you've got advantages of being spread out and that sort of thing, but there's clear disadvantages as well.
Well, and we're coming up with new tricks on how we interact, and we definitely don't have it figured out either.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's a lot to learn still.
Right. Well, really interesting from that perspective, just thinking about like, hey, all right, these networks that we've been building over time, they've changed quite a bit. One piece of research, which I think I shared with you recently, and I saw it's old stuff from Northwestern, like from 2010, this idea that diverse network or diverse groups make better decisions, but they feel a lot worse about it. And so I was thinking about this in the context, hey, if you've really slimmed down your network, you're going to feel great about what you're doing, but you're not necessarily going to be doing the right stuff.
That's exactly right. Yeah, homogenous networks, they have a lot of rapport. It feels very comfortable. People have the same values. We agree about a lot of things. And you get a very non-diverse network. And the researchers have actually shown that teams perform better when there's that diversity, like you're saying, and that there is conflict. So often we try and drive conflict out of our teams because it feels bad and it feels like things aren't working in the team. But if the conflict is on task, that is actually very healthy. You won't feel so good about the team, but the team will perform better. And when there's the sort of conflict you want to avoid, though, is relationship conflict. When you do get that going on, it is detrimental to performance.
Right. All right. So as we're thinking about, this idea of, we saw more burnout happening in the pandemic, people spiked up their effort in all sorts of ways. What were the signals that we saw that people were burning out?
Yeah, well, we did a lot of interviews to find this out. We looked at the research, and it wasn't actually great, the research out there on a lot of these topics. And so we interviewed people who were in high pressure jobs who had to perform in a sustainable way. So we interviewed surgeons, professional athletes, Navy SEAL, CIA agents, lots and lots of entrepreneurs, business people, CEOs, to see what can we learn about when are they doing it well and it's sustainable, and when do they tip over, start to burn out. And interestingly, it was tricky for people to pick up on the signals. That's what we heard from people looking back. Some of the reasons is they were doing the things which had always made them successful. They were pushing hard. They were saying yes. They were running through barriers. They were never quitting. They were giving 100%. And they'd done that, ever since their 20s. And it had worked spectacularly well. They'd got into good colleges, they'd graduated, they'd gone to good companies, or they'd started their own businesses. And so that was the formula, which had been ingrained, like, do this. And one of the things we discovered is some of the things you do in your 20s, which make you successful, are the same things which can start to burn you out, often in your 40s. We heard it was a lot in your 40s or early 50s for a lot of people, if you don't evolve your practices. And the sorts of signals to watch out for, one, you'll see it through how you're feeling. So people started to feel irritable. They started to feel exhausted. That's the big one. Exhaustion, energy starts going down. For a few people, they started to become quite detached from work. Things they used to really care about, they couldn't quite care about in the same way they used to. And they found themselves snapping at people. Second one was people get physical symptoms. So they'd have trouble sleeping, they'd have tension in their body. One lawyer we spoke to, her hair started falling out. But like everyone we interviewed, when they had these symptoms, they started to become less productive. So they couldn't get as much done as previously. And when that happened to them, what they all did, and this was almost universal, is they worked harder because they weren't getting as much done as they used to. So it sort of just exacerbated their situation. And the common theme we heard was, looking back, it was obvious what was going on to me. But I didn't see it at the time. I was completely blind to it. And I think it's sort of like the boiling frog in the water. People didn't feel that much different than they did 1 month ago, 2 months ago. It was just incrementally worse. So it crept up on them. And we sort of found there's 3 degrees of burn to watch for. It's not like I am or I'm not. First degree, sort of, you got stress. You're feeling stressed a bit. You're not that comfortable, but you're still performing well. And it's acute. The stress is there, and then later on it's gone. That's first degree burn. Secondary burn, it's starting to get chronic. The stress is there all the time. That irritability is coming in. You might be starting to get exhausted. People generally push through. And third degree burn was full burnout. This is when your body starts to shut down. People were saying they couldn't buy plane tickets. They couldn't write. They couldn't get out of bed, some of them. And that's when your body will shut down your mind from pushing it so hard.
And then I imagine the recovery process, depending on which degree you're in, is a little bit longer if you're in the third degree.
That's exactly right. And that's one thing that organizations need to pay attention to, because what we heard from a lot of people is they're experiencing third degree burn, and their manager or their company said, try some meditation, take a day off, do yoga and do things like this. And they're all good strategies if you've got first degree burn. They're absolutely ideal. But if it's going deeper, you've actually got to have much deeper changes. If it's third degree, you need to make some fundamental changes really with your mindset, with your ways of working. And sometimes it's even with your whole approach to work and values.
And so obviously we're trying to be introspective around this. Like, how are we feeling about it? When do you notice what level someone is at who's not you? Like, if I'm saying like, oh, I was talking to Nick the other day, when am I going to notice a difference in your behavior?
Yeah, that's a good point, because we heard from a lot of people, they never noticed until someone they knew and trusted pointed it out to them. I was speaking to a doctor, and he said one of his colleagues said to him, "Hey, you all right?" And he said, "Yeah, what do you mean?" And he said, "Lately, you've been super irritable and you've been snapping at a lot of people." And he said he was very surprised, and he walked away and thought about it, and he said, if he says it to me, I'm obviously doing it. And we heard that pattern a lot. Came from spouses. Sometimes it came from executive assistants or colleagues at work. So you can pick it up pretty quick in other people. It seems to be harder to see in yourself.
Yeah. And so it also sounds like it's got to be kind of that chronic thing, which, someone's doing something out of character for them regularly before it's likely someone says something.
Yes. Well, they can see it. They don't necessarily say something. So you think about people some people you would say it to because they'll listen, they'll be open-minded, and it feels safe. Some people, it doesn't feel safe to say things like that. And people at work are just like, I'm not going to say anything. He'll snap at me. So one question to ask yourself is, would it feel safe for your colleagues around you to actually point it out to you that you're acting in strange ways?
Right. And it is, I think that's something we think about on an individual basis.
Yeah.
How should we be doing it? When you think about creating a culture where the recognition of being in first, second, or third degree on this, how do you think you can actually drive a culture of that within organizations?
Yeah, it is an interesting one, because a lot of people we interviewed said when they were sort of struggling, sometimes it's the language as well. A lot of companies don't want to talk about burnout because it feels like if we use that word, everyone's going to say I'm burning out, and now we've got a huge problem. So some of them just talk about feeling overloaded. And so, that seems an easier conversation. The way we found is most effective to do it is to give leaders some metrics on themselves and then some language that they can use to talk to each other about this. So we've done this with executive teams and groups of leaders and 120 of the top leaders at a time. So we took all the insights from the research around performance, growth, motivation, values alignment, burnout risk, and sustainability, put it into an assessment, which only takes about 10 minutes to take. Mm-hmm. And so you get your results and you can see how you're tracking against all these different measures. And then based on that, we sort of debrief groups of people on it and get them to have conversations with each other. And what they've told us is they've been able to have conversations they haven't been able to have before because they got some data and they got some language. And they said, we talked about performance and we talked about growth and all that was good. The most interesting conversation was that one at the end around burnout risk, is how we phrase it. That's not a conversation we've ever had before, would have been able to have. But because we'd had all the other conversations leading up to it, it made it safe. So we found that a good way to do it.
Okay. Well, yeah, and I really like how you're talking about the assessment. So one is a self-awareness piece. You as a leader, do you actually know the signals for yourself? Do you know where you sit? So you've personalized it, and then the conversation following, hey, all right, let's give you some of the tools to be able to talk about that. And then that hopefully can drive them towards that other awareness piece.
Yeah, well, so what we give them is their individual one, then they have conversations, but we can also give them the aggregate data.
Okay.
We can give that to the organization so they can see collectively, where are our risk factors? One of the things we measure is the balance that people have between being in performance mode and growth mode. So performance mode is, we discovered this through doing the interviews. So for example, when the pandemic started, I'd done about a decade of resilience work. So I knew the topic well, and I knew how to describe it and do workshops. And when the pandemic happened, I got a lot of requests from people saying, our people are super stressed. Can you come and help and do workshops on this? So I said, yes. And I did it. And I must have run this workshop 100 times in that first year. And at the end of the year, it was very familiar to me. I knew exactly how to do it and do a good job. And at the end of the year, I remember feeling really exhausted, but also I thought I hadn't learned a new thing all year. And that was very unusual. And I was in pure perform mode, which is exploiting what you know how to do. You've already got the skills and knowledge in it, and you're just leveraging stuff that you've learned from your past and career. And the next year, I switched it around and said, I'm going to just do this research, and I'm going to dive into all these topics I've never explored before. And I was very much in explore mode. I wasn't doing as good a job. I sort of didn't know what I was doing. I didn't feel that confident, but I was growing massively. And that's the trade-off. So what we started doing is measuring, take a look at your current workload, and then we give them the assessment, and it will measure to what extent you're in one mode or the other. And what a lot of people are finding out is that they are heavily in perform mode. They're just doing the same stuff they did last year, and they basically plateaued in their growth, or they're going backwards. So that's a big aha. And when you see that on the aggregate level for an organization, it's an interesting discussion for them to have to see our leaders are not growing.
And is it like a seesaw in terms of, hey, you can do growth or you can do the perform, or does one help kind of refill the tank on the other?
Yeah, so they're polar opposites. So perform mode is exploiting what you know. So you're generally not growing that much, whereas explore mode is doing stuff you've never done before. So the way we score it, you've got 100 points and you're going to get 70-30 or 30-70 or 50-50. And there's not a best score or a best balance, but there's probably a best balance for you at this point of your career and the sort of role you're doing. And a lot of people realize they are way out of balance.
Okay. Well, and so, if we're looking for resilience on the perform side, it's more of like, hey, you got a net amount of energy. You're still going to have to do this work in terms of recovery, regardless of what your split is.
Yeah, that's right.
Thinking about growth a little bit more is not going to help your performance necessarily.
Yeah, no, not it is. It's good for long-term performance. So you think about a year of your career when you're doing really hard new stuff. That year you might not perform that well, but in the next year and the next year after that, your capacity to perform is much bigger because you've grown so much. So that's it's being long-term performance focused is when you can grow, not short.
So more like where you're going to make your investments. Okay, so
I think it's a really good way of looking at it. I mean, the way I look at it is you've got 2,000 hours a year of on-the-job experiences at work. That's your portfolio of experiences you're going to have in 2023. How are you going to divide it? And if you're going to say, I'm just going to, it's like stocks and bonds. The way I look at it, you might want to be aggressive and say I'm 90% in the share market and 10% in bonds. Or you might say I'm going to be very conservative. I'm going to be 90% in perform mode or bonds, 10% in growth and shares. And it's really it's up for people to decide what's their risk appetite for growth.
Great. And so moving into this concept of, all right, burnout is real. We're seeing it a lot. I would like to juxtapose the ideas against, like, hey, when you're in that third degree, what recovery has to look like versus prophylactic measures that you put in place to keep people from getting to those level of burn over time. So how do you think about those two ideas?
Yeah. So, like once you get full burnout, most people aren't there. So that's when you've got to take extended time off. You've got to look deep into your beliefs and stories you have and what is driving you to work the way you are. You've got to look at the sort of organization you're in and all that sort of thing. Most people aren't there. They can avoid that if they take some measures earlier on. So on the individual level, one leader we interviewed, he was an executive at one of the big technology companies. And I was interviewing him and I said, and he was saying, this culture that I'm in is extremely intense. He said, anyone who survives here for 3 years is considered a veteran. It's like, wow, how long have you been here? And he said, 10 years. And I said, well, how did you last so long without burning out? And he said, well, I didn't. I did burn out, but then I made some changes. I said, well, tell me about it. And he said, well, the first thing I did is I created some, the challenge I'd have is I'd go to work and I wouldn't take any breaks and I wouldn't take any vacations. There was always too much to do. So I just worked through and wouldn't take breaks and then I burned out. So he said, what I'm good at doing is following my calendar. If it's in my calendar, I'll do it. So I created a mechanism to ensure I took breaks, and it's called the 1-1-1 mechanism. And he said, in my calendar, start of the year, every year, I would book in one long vacation. Every quarter, I would book in a short vacation. And every month, I would book in 1 day off. And he said, that's not, I'd never take those breaks previously, but because they're in my calendar, 1-1-1, I started doing them. And he said, it really helped me just having forced breaks. I was like, that's really good. A lot of leaders have started doing that now because it's so simple. He said, but the one that made most, he said, the one that made the most difference to me, he looked at me for a while and he said, dancing. And I said, dancing, yeah. I said, what do you? He said, Argentinian tango, to be precise. It's like, what? And he said, well, what used to happen is when I go home in the evenings, I'd be thinking all the time about work and basically still in work mode. And then I'd do some emails in the evening and I just couldn't switch off from work. And then I burned out. And so he said, I've got to be able to switch off. I've got to learn. So he tried different things, but he said, I tried Argentinian tango. And what I discovered was that was the opposite of my work world. He said, in Argentinian tango, no one cares about how much money you make. No one cares what your job title is. They don't care who you work for. They don't even care if you have a job. That is all irrelevant. The only thing that matters, the currency is, can you dance? And he said, that's the only thing. And so he said, so I'd go along, 2 hours in the evening, the music would be going, I'm moving around, I'm in my body, I'm in my heart, I'm sweating. And he said, I'm not in my head, I'm in my heart, I'm in my body. And I finish and I sort of go home and I feel quite refreshed and I feel really good. And I wake up the next morning and I feel really recharged. It's like my work identity and mode has disappeared for a few hours. And this is the only time it ever happened to me. And so we kept interviewing people when we heard this pattern over and over again, that people who learned to perform sustainably, they knew how to work hard, but they had an opposite world activity which very efficiently and effectively switched them out of work mode and recharged them. We heard an investment banker, it was quilting, which is
That's
very
awesome.
work world.
Yeah.
And we heard people, it was deep water swimming, or it was running in nature with their dogs. And so the question, we ask leaders now when we take them through this stuff is, do you have an opposite world? And so and we sort of get three answers. Maybe a third of people say, yes, I didn't have that name for it, but yes, it is this. And when I do it, it's amazing.
Right.
about a third say, no, I can't think of anything at all. It sounds like a great idea, but I just don't have anything. And a third say, I used to. I used to have something, but I stopped doing it because life got too busy, work got too busy, had a family or had kids and got direct reports. And so I stopped doing it. It wasn't a priority. And they start to see it actually is a priority. It's the most efficient, effective way to help you recharge and sustainably perform over time.
Okay. And, maybe just digging in on this a little bit, because I think it's really, really interesting. Was there anything that came out on frequency, intensity of what that opposite world activity has to be for it to have a protective effect?
Yeah. So we sort of learned, I wrote a LinkedIn post on this after the interview, and it's the most commented LinkedIn post I've ever written. Hundreds or maybe thousands of people put comments, because at the end I said, do you have an opposite world? And people just put in their opposite worlds. And cool. So I went through and just categorized. So I thought, are there any patterns to what these are? And we saw they fell in 6 different buckets, types of categories. The first one was nature. Perhaps the most popular was nature. Getting out of nature. Next one was some sort of physical activity that people did. Third one was some creative pursuit. It was playing guitar, it was doing quilting, it was music, something like that, painting.
Yeah.
Fourth was home projects, doing some sort of renovation or building something. Fifth was animals, and 6th was volunteering. And what we heard was if you have one in any of those, it's very valuable for you if it fits you and your personality, and it's opposite work. But if you do something which combines multiple areas, it seems to be especially protective. So people running with their dog through the forest, 3 different things, it was really good for them. But frequency, it is. The bigger the thing is, so if people say skiing, well, that's good, but that's hard to do, Wednesday after work. So sometimes we need to be creative to see, I might have a big thing I'm going to do, but is there something I can do 2 or 3 times a week, which seems to really help.
Okay. Well, I think that's interesting, because we can use that as a way to craft what we're doing. Where I originally went to when you were talking about the Argentinian dancing was, I'm thinking like, you've got to react to a partner, like your brain is totally present around that, but it doesn't seem like that's not a universal for requiring being able to react to someone else on this. The 6th thing that you listed, that wasn't necessarily true at all.
That's true. What was universal about these things we discovered is it got people very much into the moment, and their story of themselves as a CEO or as, as a chief of staff or whatever title or story it's really an identity. That disappeared, and they had a different identity, but they were very much in a flow state. That was the common thing we heard. They were in a flow state, but also that it was the opposite. One person I interviewed, I said to her, what's your opposite world, do you think? And she said, it's going to the gym. I said, okay, good. She goes, the strange thing is, after I come home, I sit on the sofa and I just lie down. I know I'm exhausted. I said, sounds strange. Tell me more about what the gym is like. She said, it's this particular gym where you go along and you compete with other people, and you can see their metrics and numbers up above the treadmill. And so basically you're just trying to beat everyone else and win. And I said, okay. So how different is that from your work day? And she thought about it. She goes, it's exactly the same. Yeah. It was like, that's not my opposite world, is it? I'm in the same mental mode. Right. She thought about it and she said, deep ocean swimming. When I go deep ocean swimming, that is the only time my brain switches off, complete silence, and I just see the creatures on the bottom of the ocean floor, cold water on my body, and there's just silence. That's my opposite world. So it is a bit of a trap, because especially A-type personalities, they go hard at work, and then when they go away to do their other stuff, it's it's an Ironman, and it's an endurance thing, and it's some really competitive thing, which it might be okay, but do watch how different is it from your work?
Right.
Often more achievement.
Interesting.
Mm.
Well, Nick, this was awesome for our discussion. We're about half past the hour. So thank you so much for this portion. Really, really appreciate it. Where can people learn more about what you're doing, about the assessment that you built, things like that?
Yeah, I've got a website, www.nicholaspetrie.com. And so you can look at things there. Probably the best place to read things is if you go to my LinkedIn. So if you just go to Nick Petrie, leadership, you'll see it. And that's where I've written up all of the insights in very short posts. Cool. So all the different things we discovered, it's all on LinkedIn.
All right. Very digestible. Excellent. Thanks a ton, Nick.
Pleasure, Matt.